Good morning to you all. I'm really glad to be with you all. I met some of you before. If I did not get a chance to say hi, my name's Craig Hefner. I'm a friend of Mason. I have the privilege of serving as the head of school at Covenant School over in Huntington, where I've convinced Mason a bunch of times to come speak for chapel. So I think I owed him a favor, and I'm glad to be here today. This is a really wonderful church I have kind of seen from afar, and so I'm really glad to get to be here with you all on a Sunday. I also come to you with some envy over Charleston because you guys have a lot of nice things. Every time I come out here, I leave with just a little bit of bitterness that you have a First Watch and a Taylor Books, and it makes me a little upset that we don't have those things in Huntington. I have to come all the way over here for some good coffee and things like that. But despite that bitterness, I'm happy to be with you all this morning. I'm going to draw our attention to Genesis 1 this morning. And so if you want to follow along with me, we're going to be in Genesis 1. I'm going to kind of refer around both Genesis 1 and 2 a little bit, but that's where we're going to camp out. What I want to talk about is the doctrine of the image of God, which I have been convicted lately is something that I confess in theory, but don't actually know what it looks like to believe in practice in my actual relationships with other people. And so I've just reflected much on this doctrine and want to invite you all into that. And so if you're with me here in Genesis 1, I think it's really astounding that the Bible opens with this amazing chapter where God is speaking things into existence from nothing. He uses just words and he makes things. That's an astounding amount of power and creativity. And then a little bit later in Genesis 1:27, it says, "And then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness.'" That's Genesis 1:27. And if you just ponder that for a minute, you think, okay, so the God who was just speaking things into existence from nothing, the God who existed in some mysterious way infinitely before and prior to everything that has ever happened or ever was, made us in his image. Like, that is a staggering reality to comprehend. It's maybe even hard to believe. And of course, what I find even more astonishing is that the rest of the chapter of Genesis 1 and 2 doesn't back off at all from that implication, but actually keeps pushing it further and making it really clear that we don't miss the fact that God who is mysteriously able to create things from nothing and his enormous amount of power does in fact make us in his image. So right, in the very beginning, God is speaking things into existence, and then a little bit later in this same book, Adam is given the sort of weird task of naming the animals. Do you remember that part of the story? I've never known what to make of that peculiar thing that happens. It's a bit of a weird story, if we're honest, and I don't know that we often get the point, but if we are thinking about what just happened in Genesis 1, the parallel is a bit more obvious. Naming the animals is a lot like what God was doing in Genesis 1. Now, it's not the same thing because the things already are there. So Adam is just naming them, but they at least exist. So that's different, but still it's words somehow like doing a creative act. And in our culture, we don't think of that as a big deal, but if you recall other biblical Old Testament stories, like naming was a big deal, right? Whenever there's a name given to somebody, there's always like a deep explanation for that name. When Moses encounters the burning bush, what does he want to know right away? I can't go back to them unless I know your name. And like knowing the name of God was a big part of being able to do anything. Like I can't accomplish anything if I don't know your name. So names were heavy things in the Old Testament world. So when Adam is naming, it's not like just a biology class of like zebra, giraffe. That's how it reads to us, I think, a little bit. But it means like he is imposing order on the animals, almost creative-like. It's a real power that's given to Adam. And in Genesis 2:20, it does make it really clear. It says, and whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. So it's like, really, Adam has the power to name, and that's a big deal. That is how the Bible opens up. And it's opening up with, of course, this amazing vision of God creating, but it's also an astonishingly high view of human beings and what we are. And it should, I think, take our breath away a little bit to really think and believe for a moment that you and I and all the people we interact with are correctly called creatures made in the image of God, or imago Dei, which is sometimes used as the Latin word for it. Here, though, is the problem, I think, and why I wanted to talk about this text and this doctrine, is that we don't really believe that if push comes to shove. We would say that we believe that human beings are made in the image of God, but it is oftentimes maybe just intellectual assent. Like I know it says that in Genesis 1:27. That's a neat phrase. But has the idea really gone down deep into our imaginations, into our hearts and souls? Let me give an example. We may confess with our lips that the human beings around us are made in the image of God, but then we snub our neighbors, we gossip about coworkers, or we find a phone or a screen or something to be massively more entertaining than the people around us. That is an example in my mind of the tension I have felt with believing the doctrine, but then like no actions kind of correspond to that. Like I find a lot of things naturally more interesting than people. And yet people are the things called image bearers of God. So that's upside down. So I wanted to pick up this topic and really think about why is it so hard to really believe in the image of God? Why is it so hard to believe in it and act according to it? And I think as we think about it, there's actually a lot of reasons and forces around us that make it hard. And we don't want to be hypocritical. I don't think anyone intentionally is like, I believe in the image of God doctrine, but then I'm going to act completely unaccording to it. I think that there's cultural forces and pressures that have slowly seeped into our minds that make it hard. And so the invitation today is to return back to Genesis 1:27 and call it to actually shape the way we not just think, but the way we act towards one another. And I don't want to pretend that's easy. So I'm going to start with a couple questions. So I have 3 questions that I want to ask today and try to answer. My background is definitely more in teaching, so it's more comfortable for me to have question and answer format this morning. So 3 questions that we're going to go through. 1, where has the idea come from? I call it the dehumanizing idea. Where has the dehumanizing idea come from where it's like it's really unnatural for us to believe in the uniqueness of human beings? Let's understand the source of that so that we can get rid of it. Number 2, what really is the image of God? We use it a lot. We say the words a lot, but what really is it? What do we mean by that phrase? If we can't really identify it and mean something by it, it makes it all the harder to actually carry out that belief in our lives. And then number 3, what does it look like to actually believe this doctrine in my action? Those are my 3 questions. So where did it come from where's the dehumanizing view come from? What really is the image of God? And what are some ways that it would actually look like to believe it for real in our actions, in our lives? All right, so question 1, where's this dehumanizing view come from and what really is it where that has come from? And to summarize, the view that I think we all get influenced by is paradoxically to think too much and too little of human beings at the same time. That's kind of the culturally prevailing view, which is, it's got an intrinsic contradiction in it, and we'll see why as we unpack it, hopefully. I want to illustrate this point with somewhat of a funny story. I moved here, I think I told some of you when I was chatting before, but I moved to Huntington, West Virginia, from Chicago, Illinois, which is really different from Huntington, West Virginia. And even though you guys have Taylor Books, and it's still not Chicago over here. So, and First Watch and all these nice things. It's still different. So there was this really obvious, and when I got here, right, there were all these questions right away, like, well, what is that like culturally? What's it like to move from Chicago to West Virginia? And there are differences, right, that you pick up on. And I think this kind of illustrates, now this is a story that's actually favorable to West Virginia. This is why I live here and not in Chicago now, but it does illustrate the kind of tensions about what human beings really are. When I got here, genuinely, it threw me off in a very significant way. Two things really threw me off. The first is the driving and people waving thing that we do around here. We don't do that in Chicago. People love to do that in West Virginia. And now I love to do it too, but I did not when I got here. And then also, in a very similar way, the excessive eye contact when you walk down the street made me very uncomfortable. Because typically, if people made eye contact with you walking down Chicago, something like unpleasant was going to follow. And so you didn't want that. And so you just got very used to head down, no looking at somebody, all the time. And when you're driving, it's like, you can't wave at a million people a day. So you just stop, right? When you get here, it's like, yeah, hi. Like, my assumption as a Chicago native was I must know that person, but I just got here because why else are we doing this in the car? But they don't know me, right? It's a nice thing to do. So and it's obviously because of just the mass number of people in a big city. You can't wave to everybody in the car every time, or you'd be doing this constantly. And so then over time, you just stop doing it, and you start to get really good at snubbing people and ignoring people because it's not reasonable to give the kind of human attention that people actually deserve in every single occasion. That is going on the one hand. On the other hand, you're surrounded by some of the most magnificent cultural artifacts that human beings have created. You have these massive skyscrapers that human beings built, and you have art museums full of Monets and beautiful things and all kinds of like musical, cultural things going on. And that's the tension right there. It's like, on the one hand, people are just in the way and I need to snub them. And on the other hand, they can do godlike things. And that's the worldview out there, I think. And where that came from is a theological thing. So when people stopped believing in the doctrine of the image of God, what first happened was that it got replaced by people. People just became gods. It was like, we will do the work of God. We will build what we want. We will decide what is true and good for our own selves. So we put ourselves in the seat of God. And that's where it started. And then soon after that, when you decide that human beings are actually gods and you don't want to recognize an actual supreme God beyond you, then you realize, oh, if we're God, then really there isn't a God and there's kind of nothing. It's just really us. And that's how you end up with this paradoxical view that's kind of the culturally prevailing assumption on human beings, which is that we're simultaneously think of ourselves as gods who can create anything and should decide what is true for your own self and not submit to any authorities, biblical or otherwise, just to nothing. Just your own true self is the God. And also they're just creatures that are really just dust and there's nothing to us. When we die, nothing happens. Like, those are the two views at the same time. Thinking way too high and way too low of human beings is the cultural view out there. Those are both incorrect from the Bible's perspective of ways of thinking about human beings. And I want to make it really clear as we're going to unpack, I think, the right answer. It's easy to hear me saying the cultural view is that human beings are too low. We're just dust and nothing but sort of biological material that will pass away someday, or we're gods who can create our own truth and decide what's real. It is not like we want to be in the middle of those two. We don't want to do like the Goldilocks thing of like take a little bit of too high and too low and mix them. You can't. You'll end up falling back into one of the two over and over. So the right answer is not to think right in the middle of human beings. It's actually Genesis 1:27. It is to say, no, it's not too high, it's not too little. Human beings, the answer is, they're image of God. That's what they are. That's the right answer. So that's why it's so important to actually understand, what is that when we say the image of God? All right, so that's the dehumanizing view. I think that's the view that kind of influences us, thinking too high, thinking too little. Let's do question 2 now. What really is the image of God? What really is it? And so for this, we can finally go back to Genesis 1:27, and look at some of the context around it and learn a bit about what it means. So much has been said about these words that I can't possibly summarize all of it this morning, but I think if we're trying to understand this doctrine together, there's a few textual observations that you should just have in your head as you're thinking about what is the image of God. And here's a few of them. So note in Genesis 1, if you read it some other time, you'll pick up on this. Every time that God makes something, it talks about them being made according to their kind. So he makes the livestock and the beasts, and he makes them I'm just looking at 1:24, for instance. He makes livestock and beasts according to their kind. And he makes the winged birds according to its kind. And that phrase over and over and over. Everything is made according to their kind. And then you get to Genesis 1:27, and it does not say that God made us according to our kind. It kind of breaks it, which is a surprise. So that if we're paying attention to the text, it's like, oh, it's saying something different about human beings. We're not made according to their kind. We're made according to the image of God. So it's very different from everything else. It breaks the mold, and it's meant to kind of be a startling point that human beings are obviously very different. Now, we're going to unpack that point a bit more later, but obviously what that means is that, and this is true, an animal, anything else that we've referred to in Genesis 1, winged birds, livestock, beasts of the earth, if you want to understand what they are, you understand them in reference to their own kind. So like a proper dog does dog things, and I can understand what a dog is by just seeing how other dogs behave, and this should do the same thing. So I understand dogs in reference to other dogs. That's it. They are made according to their own kind, and they kind of automatically do that. We cannot understand ourselves, is what this Genesis is saying, with reference just to ourselves. We have to figure out what the image of God is to make sense of ourselves. So it immediately calls us to look elsewhere for understanding what we are. That's observation number 1. This according to their kind. And then, human beings are not according to the kind. They're according to image of God. At the same time, Adam, the name Adam does mean dirt. So there is an obvious sense that we are like the animals. We're made from dust. And we're also made on the 6th day with the other creatures. And so that's kind of the opposite point. Is actually, that's to not think too highly of ourselves. Remember, we're not actually gods. We were made like the animals from dust. And then it's just a really profound moment to make a third point in Genesis 2:19 and 20, where it says, the man said, right? And he starts to speak, and he starts to name the animals. And it's pretty clear that human language, poetry making, speaking, naming animals, becomes a pretty clear picture of what human beings are supposed to be in the business of doing, which is another reminder that, again, these are creatures who are, in a radical way, made like God. Now, just very quickly, for those of you who want to know the view, this is sort of the teaching side of me, but there's lots of debate about what the image of God actually is. And there's not a lot of agreement on it, but there's kind of 3 really common ideas, and they all kind of seem to partially pick up on something in the text. So I think there's something to each of them, and they're not in contradiction with each other. So, and those are these. The first is called the substantial view. The second is called the relational view. and the third is called the functional view. And that's the three things are, the substantial is like that there's something, there's a what to us that makes us in the image of God. Typically that's identified with the soul or rationality, our ability to think and use language, which is our rational capacity. That's been a very common answer as Christians have thought about what is it that makes us human beings special. They've pointed to, well, this thing can talk and do poetry and use language and has a rational ability that is not true of other creatures. And that totally could be it. I would say is definitely the most traditional answer. There's a whole host of debates about that because it raises questions like, what about when I'm sleeping? Am I less in the image of God at that time because my brain isn't really working in the same way? What about people who, for various reasons, have had injury or mental disabilities who can't think in the same way? Are they less in the image of God? And we don't want to say that, of course. So there's some tension there of trying to figure out how it could be true that everybody's in the image of God if you have varying ranges. Of course, the answer is that everybody is potentially able to have rationality, even if we're not doing it at all at the same time. But there's something really radically unique about human beings, and that's kind of the point of that view. And it might even be something about like how our bodies are actually made and the kind of mental capacity we're given. There might be a very real thing in us that makes us different from animals. The second one is often called the relational view, which is kind of picks up on the fact that it says that we make man in our image, and it kind of invites us to think about the Trinitarian God making human beings perhaps to be in community. And then, of course, immediately after being created, Adam is alone and is looking for a partner. And so there's this seeking for relationships, both Godward and humanward, and maybe that's what makes us in the image of God. Probably so. That's also in the text. The third is called the functional view, which is that we were made to accomplish certain things, which really picks up on the fact that God charges Adam with making dominion over the earth, and it may be in doing that we're made in the image of God. I don't know. Those all are kind of in Genesis 1, and it doesn't really matter which one you hold to. I think the point is ultimately that the scholarly issue kind of aside, the image of God is a statement, whatever it really means, about radically exceptional human beings are from other creatures, and how absolutely unique is the manner of our creation and our purpose. And so you can kind of summarize it just by really sinking your head into the word, image of God, which I think perfectly avoids both thinking too little and too much of human beings, which is the prevailing cultural view. It does so because for the first word, image, image is a reminder right away that we're not self-contained, that we really can't make sense of ourselves. Our lives would be meaningless and make no sense without a reference to outside of ourselves. So we are a mirror or an image. Something external is where we're going to find our reference point. That's kind of a low view of humanity, right? Like we're not self-contained. We can't make sense of our own lives. So whatever it is, whatever we are just meant to be an image of something else at our best. We have to refer outside. That's, again, very different from the animals who are made according to their kind. Like you can make sense of them without referencing outside of them. So that's image. Image is a reminder that we have to locate who we are elsewhere. That's a very humbling point. Image of God is the opposite. That's a really empowering and uplifting note. So if we're imaging something, that reminds us that we can't make sense of ourselves on our own. But then of God is that's an uplifting, high view of humanity to say that's what we image. So that's the kind of majestic point that avoids us thinking too little of human beings. And I think this is a really profound thing to reflect on, is that only according to Scripture, human beings are in the image of God. And so ponder for a moment that everything else is not. Think for a moment about the most majestic, delightful, beautiful, powerful thing you've ever seen, besides another human being, something like a waterfall, a mountain, the stars, whatever majestic thing is coming to your mind, even like a civilization that's lasted a long time, none of those things are worthy of being called in the image of God, as powerful as those things are. They're just created things among other things in Genesis 1. So whatever you really think the image of God actually is, we don't have to figure it out exactly today. It does help us to neither think too high nor too low of what we are. All right, let's get to the practical thing, which kind of wraps it up for me, which is question 3. What does it look like to believe this doctrine in my actions? And this is where I think it gets hard, because all of the other stuff is theoretical and sounds great to say, but oftentimes the dehumanizing view of thinking too little or too much of others is really what dominates how I tend to see people, how I interact with people. It's pretty hard to act according to really the belief that God made human beings, all of us, in his image, and really believe and act that way. And so I want to call us here at the end to really believe this doctrine. Here's a couple examples. First is just I'm going to talk about examples against the thinking too high or thinking too low. So against the tendency to think too little of ourselves as nothing more than a lump of dirt, cells, DNA, just matter that will pass away. We really do need to confess with Genesis 1:27 that human beings are made exceptionally in the image of God. We are exemptional creatures made to reflect the divine. So here's a concrete practice then that I find really difficult. We ought to treat creatures and people around us like eternal things who do in fact last forever and who have eternal consequence. And so you might just reflect on this question: do you, or how do you, attend with interest to people around you as if they are creatures who will last forever, who are vastly more important than anything else? Do you realize that your actions toward another person, this is the point that C.S. Lewis has made in a couple of really great essays that I have never forgotten, do you realize that your actions towards other people are literally going to last forever? Like on them. Or if not on them, in you, right? Because you're an eternal creature, so the kind of soul you're cultivating is an eternal thing. And what you do with it does last forever. So if you snub your neighbor, this is the Lewis's phrase, that's actually a permanent effect on them and on you. Because people are vastly more important than anything else. And I contrast that in my mind between like the way I might respond to like spilling coffee on my laptop or something, some material thing, right? And like the immediate concern that I have for the thing. But then not near that kind of concern for being disrespectful or snubbing or just caring inadequately about someone else who's actually a permanent creature, unlike everything else. In that same way of not thinking too little of ourselves, do we really give people a chance to surprise us? Do we really believe that people are irreducibly complex? This is like really believing that people are actually really interesting because they're image bearers and worthy of serious contemplation and serious interaction. Not trivial interaction, but really robust, like it's worth getting to know somebody because no matter what their story is, they're an image bearer and they're doing something with that. And it's worth figuring out what they're doing with it. It's actually way more interesting than anything else because they have they have an eternal soul in them, and they're doing something with it. And what are they doing? Like, do we really attend to people with that kind of interest of like, people are really interesting and kind of should pull us in? Not in an idolatrous sense, like, but just in the sense of like recognizing like God made all of us around, all these people around us, and because God made them, they're really interesting. We have to like attend to people with that kind of interest. That would look like, that's what it would seem like to me if I thought about like a church. It would be like, if we really believed with the image of God, really believed it, we would definitely ask people different kinds of questions, like interact with them in a different kind of way. So, in short, we almost should have like a magical, otherworldly view of human beings. Not, of course, to worship them ever, but to see them correctly as God does, as image bearers of his divine nature, which are people endowed with unique properties and worthy of being called image bearers. So that is to call us to think upward about human beings around us. Now, the opposite tendency has its own practical implications. So against the tendency to think too great of ourselves, we need to remind ourselves that we are not self-contained. We are only complete if we refer outside of ourselves, because we are most fundamentally an image, a mirror. And so the concrete practice here would be to work so hard to deny our own tendency to become our own God or to mistake people around us as gods, even if we find them interesting and worthy of interaction. They're never their own God. And instead, to take up the cross and know that to be like Christ is actually to be the most like properly a human being. That we have to get our sense of self from somewhere else altogether and resist the temptation to decide, to take the faculties that God has given us and to use them to carve out a life different from what God intends you to do with those capacities. So the question here to reflect on would be, do you look inward to figure out who you are? Or do you correctly look outward to Christ as the model for how to be human? And when you do that, you will find, I think, that we would receive grace and the assurance that we don't need to figure ourselves out, that we can receive ourselves back. And that's what it would look like to live according to the image of God. Not to think too little, not to think too much, but to actually think of ourselves correctly as creatures made to image what God is. I'll pray for us, and I'll invite up whatever occurs after this for me. So join me, if you will, in prayer. God, we give you thanks this morning for this astounding word that you have made us in your image. I pray that against the temptations to think too high, too little, that you will reach deep into our hearts and transform our imaginations and our actions towards others, to view others and ourselves as you have called us to be viewed, as creatures, though endowed with unbelievable faculties, are ultimately at best called to imitate you and Christ's life. Give us grace as we pursue that ambitious goal. We would depend on your help at every turn for it. We lift up to you all the week. We lift up to you the week ahead of us. May you move this doctrine from just our heads and into our concrete actions and our practices towards other human beings as you've called us to. Give us grace and wisdom to that end. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.